When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart sank, not because of the fear of being caught, but because of those messages. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I tried to grab the phone back, but he pulled it away with surprising quickness, his thumb continuing to glide across the screen. I watched his face, the way his expression changed line by line, and I could feel my life unraveling in seconds. Yes, now he would learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled further, and I knew he was about to reach that message, the one that would destroy everything. The one that would explain everything and yet make it all even more confusing. My phone suddenly vibrated in his grip, and a new notification lit up the screen. I saw the color drain from his face when he read the sender's name. He froze. He didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when nerves got the better of me. My anxiety mixed with the dread of realizing what I had done. His breathing grew faster, I could hear it even from the 2 feet between us. This was exactly what I feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that would change everything forever. And now, I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it all truly happened. Before I share the secret I worked so hard to bury, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever kept a secret so desperately, only for it to slip through your fingers in the end? I used to think that life after 50 would feel stable, like the slow rhythm of an old song you knew by heart. And in some ways, it did. My days had the same patterns: waking up next to my husband, making coffee, watching the news in muted tones, and packing up for work before the city even had the chance to stir. Our house was warm, our routine solid, and yet I often felt like I was living inside a photograph, perfectly framed, but unmoving, untouched by time, and untouched by much else. There was nothing wrong with my marriage. That's the thing. He was a good man, steady, dependable, never cruel. He remembered to take out the trash, to check the locks before bed, to ask how my day had been. But his questions had turned into background noise over the years, the way rain sometimes becomes an unnoticed hum. How was work, he'd ask. Did you sleep well? What's for dinner? None of those questions were wrong, they were safe. Too safe. I didn't know when I started noticing the gaps. The way his hand no longer brushed against mine when we passed in the kitchen. The way we'd watch TV together but sit on opposite ends of the couch, our bodies almost allergic to touch. It wasn't dramatic, there was no shouting, no slammed doors. Just a quiet erosion, so subtle that you only see it once a whole cliff has crumbled away. Then came the email, the one from HR about the company retreat. * mandatory attendance for all senior staff. 4 days. Private island. Team building activities. * the idea made me laugh at first. A private island? It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a glossy brochure no one actually believed. But the longer I stared at the words, the more they lodged themselves under my skin. A trip. Away from everything familiar. A chance to breathe. When I told my husband, he didn't look up from his laptop. When is it? He asked, his voice flat, like I had just mentioned a dentist appointment. Next month, I said. It's on an island. HR says it's meant to help reset company culture. He made a non-committal sound, the kind people make when they're half listening. You'll need to pack light, he said after a pause. And that was it. He didn't ask who I'd be sharing a room with, what the island looked like, whether I was excited. Nothing. Just that flat remark, like we were talking about taking the garbage out on Tuesday instead of leaving our lives behind for 4 days. That night, I stood in front of the closet, running my fingers over dresses I hadn't worn in years. Something stirred in me, not quite excitement, but something close. I picked up a soft, linen sundress, the kind I hadn't thought about wearing in a decade, and held it against myself in the mirror. It felt strange, almost guilty, to wonder what it would be like to wear it somewhere far from home, to feel the fabric move in warm wind. Work became different after that email. Every conversation at the office buzzed with anticipation: who would share a villa with whom, what the schedule might look like, if the CEO himself would actually be there. The CEO. That name alone carried weight. He wasn't just a boss. He was the boss. The one everyone talked about in lowered voices, like speaking too loudly might summon him. Charismatic, sharp, the kind of man who could make a joke sound like a challenge. I'd seen him only a handful of times in person, conference rooms, formal events, and each time, his presence seemed to shift the air, as if the walls leaned in closer to listen. I told myself that he wouldn't even notice me on that island. He barely knew my name. But as the departure day crept closer, I started catching myself in little moments. Adding a touch of lipstick before a Zoom call, though my camera was off. Standing a little straighter when I walked past his office. I told myself it was silly. Just the thrill of change, that's all. The morning we left, the city was still asleep. The shuttle bus idled outside the office building, the driver sipping coffee from a paper cup while colleagues huddled in small clusters, pulling suitcases behind them. The air smelled faintly of rain. I climbed aboard, sat by the window, and felt a strange mix of nerves and relief. The streets rolled by, then the highway, and then the ferry dock, the sea stretching out like a promise. When the ferry pulled away from the mainland, I went up on deck. The wind tangled in my hair, the salt clung to my lips, and for the first time in years, I felt lighter. That's when I saw him. The CEO stood near the railing, hands in his pockets, looking out at the horizon. He wasn't surrounded by the usual crowd of assistants or managers, just standing alone, his posture relaxed, as if he owned not only the ferry but the ocean itself. For a moment, he turned his head. Our eyes met. It wasn't long. A second, maybe less. But something passed between us, a flicker I couldn't name. I told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I already knew that trip would not be what I expected. And neither would I. The island looked nothing like the photographs on the HR brochure, it was better. When the ferry pulled into the dock, the water shimmered a color I hadn't seen in years, as if the sea itself had been repainted for us. The air was heavy with salt and hibiscus, and the heat pressed against my skin like a reminder that I wasn't at home anymore. The last stretch of land I knew was already a fading blur on the horizon. Colleagues were chattering around me, dragging suitcases over the wooden boards, laughing too loudly, their excitement spilling into the air like champagne bubbles. I stood still for a moment, letting it all wash over me, that strange feeling of stepping into a world that didn't belong to me yet. And then, there he was. The CEO. He walked off the ferry without any of the awkwardness the rest of us had, no fumbling with bags, no checking schedules or fussing over name tags. He didn't need to. He moved like someone who knew exactly where he was going, like the island itself was waiting for him. He glanced at me once, a passing flicker, and it was nothing, or maybe it was everything. The HR team gathered us on the dock, chirping instructions about shuttle vans, room keys, and evening schedules. Their voices felt distant. The sun was already sinking lower, softening into the golden hour that photographers love, and that's when I noticed him again, leaning against the railing of a van, laughing quietly at something one of the senior managers had said. I hated how easily my eyes found him, how they stayed there longer than they should. The ride from the dock to the villas was short, the kind of ride that feels longer because of the silence in your own head. The road wound through palm trees and low hills, the windows opened just enough to let in the scent of salt and soil. When we arrived, I couldn't help it, I stared. The villas weren't just buildings, They were pieces of glass and stone that seemed carved into the landscape. Each one had wide terraces that faced the ocean, curtains that moved lazily with the breeze, and doors that opened to a view most people only dreamed of. I was sharing a villa with 2 other colleagues I barely knew. We exchanged polite smiles as we unpacked, murmured something about dinner plans, and then slipped into our own corners. I placed my suitcase by the bed, opened it, and paused. The sundress I had packed, the one I hadn't worn in a decade, sat on top. I ran my hand over the fabric, soft and almost fragile under my fingers. By the time the evening came, the island had transformed. The sun had melted into the horizon, and the paths between the villas were lined with lanterns that glowed in quiet pools of light. The air had cooled just enough to make the night feel gentle. The dining area wasn't what I expected. There were no walls, just a stretch of tables under open sky, the ocean close enough that you could hear the waves brushing the shore. I sat near the end of one of the tables, a plate in front of me I barely touched. Around me, the others were already drinking, laughing, telling stories that sounded rehearsed for the occasion. He arrived later. Not late enough to be noticed, but late enough to be felt. The CEO walked in without needing to announce himself. He didn't have to. Heads turned subtly, voices dipped for a second, and then rose again, trying too hard to sound natural. He took a seat a few places down from me, close enough that I could hear his low voice in conversation, too far to justify staring. And yet, I found myself doing just that, tracing the shape of his gestures, the way he leaned in when someone spoke, the way his laugh didn't sound like the careful politeness I'd expected. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Dinner stretched on, the kind of long, lazy evening that only islands know how to create. Plates cleared, wine poured again and again, the hum of voices blending with the waves. When most of the others had drifted off to explore the grounds or return to their rooms, I stayed behind, lingering by the terrace, my fingers curled around the edge of my glass. The night was warm, and the sky was a dark sheet scattered with stars. That's when he came over. He didn't ask if he could join me. He just stood beside me, close enough that I felt the heat of him in the small space between us. "Beautiful place," he said, his voice low, not meant to break the silence, but to slip into it. "Yes," I answered, my own voice quieter than I intended. The conversation wasn't much, nothing that would matter to anyone else. He said something about the ocean air, how it made people feel younger, lighter. I smiled, and he smiled back, and there was something unspoken in that exchange, like an invisible thread pulling tighter. He reached for my glass, just for a second, his hand brushing mine, and that small contact sent something sharp and hot through me, something I hadn't felt in years. I should have stepped back. I didn't. He leaned closer, his face a breath away, and in that suspended moment, the kind that stretches into forever, we kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't careful. It was quick and quiet, and it changed everything. When he pulled away, he didn't say anything. Neither did I. He left first, walking back into the lantern light as if nothing had happened. I stayed on the terrace, my heart beating too fast, the taste of wine and salt still on my lips, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't know who I was anymore. The next morning, the island felt sharper, as if the air itself knew something had shifted. The sunlight seemed too bright, the sea too loud, every sound and color pressing against me. I sat on the small balcony outside my room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold long before I took a sip, staring at the horizon, replaying the night before over and over again. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened, not to myself. That kiss, quick, almost quiet, but unmistakable, kept flashing in my mind like a photograph I hadn't meant to take but couldn't delete. It hadn't been a long kiss, not the kind that leaves no question about intention. But it also wasn't meaningless. I couldn't convince myself it was just a polite mistake, Some cultural misunderstanding or an overstep he didn't think through. No, there had been intent in it, and worse, there had been intent in me when I didn't step away. I told myself, sitting there with that cold coffee, that it had to stay there, in that single, strange moment. That it didn't mean anything more. That I could fold it up like a letter I never sent and tuck it somewhere in the back of my mind. But the lie barely lasted through breakfast. The villa's dining space was quieter than the night before. The energy of the arrival had burned out, and everyone seemed slower, more subdued, maybe even hungover. I sat at the far side of the table, picking at fruit, and tried not to look for him. I failed. He walked in mid-meal, like nothing at all had happened the night before. His voice was low when he greeted a few people by name, his tone casual, his face unreadable. He didn't look at me immediately. That should have been a relief, but somehow it wasn't. It made me itch with the question of whether he was ignoring me on purpose, whether last night was already nothing to him, or if it was the opposite. When our eyes finally met, it wasn't dramatic. No movie-worthy pause, no gasp. Just a glance, a fraction too long, before he moved on to sit at the other end of the table. But in that small look was something unspoken, and I felt it like a spark against dry grass. I barely ate. After breakfast, HR herded us into groups for team-building activities, another reminder of the strange, thin line between vacation and obligation that this trip seemed to balance on. We hiked through a trail that twisted through palm groves, the air sticky with heat and the constant hum of insects. I told myself to focus on the ground beneath my feet, the smell of the earth, the soft crunch of dried leaves. But he was there too, just ahead of me, sometimes falling back to walk with someone, sometimes moving forward again. He never walked next to me, not directly, but the awareness of him was constant, a low hum beneath everything else. At one point, when we stopped at a clearing to drink water, he caught my eye across the group. Just a look, steady, level, without the smile he'd worn the night before. It wasn't flirtation this time. It was heavier than that. By lunch, I was exhausted, though not from the hike. It was the weight of pretending, the effort of acting as if I wasn't aware of every accidental brush, every word that might have held another meaning. I went back to the villa in the afternoon, hoping to clear my head, but the walls felt too close. I unpacked the rest of my clothes, laying them in the wardrobe like that would settle me, but instead it felt like I was digging myself deeper into this place, like I was setting roots in sand. I thought about calling my husband. The thought came like a jolt of guilt, sharp and sudden. I hadn't told him about the kiss, of course. The idea of saying it out loud was absurd, impossible. But even the thought of hearing his voice felt complicated now. I pressed his contact on my phone anyway, the way you do something you know might hurt because not doing it feels worse. He answered on the third ring. His voice was steady, as it always was. "How's the island?" he asked, and I could picture him sitting at the kitchen table, probably with his glasses on, reading something on his laptop while he spoke to me. "It's beautiful," I said. My voice sounded thin, like a string pulled too tight. "What's the weather like?" "Warm." We spoke for a few minutes, the usual things, how the flight was, how the house was, what he'd had for dinner last night. The words were fine, ordinary. But they scraped against me like sandpaper. He didn't ask what I was doing right then, or who I was with. He didn't ask if I was happy. When we hung up, the silence in the room felt different. He had no idea what I was hiding. That thought should have been comforting. Instead, it made the air in the villa feel thin, like I couldn't get enough of it. That evening, there was another gathering, less formal than dinner, more like an impromptu circle around a fire pit on the beach. Most of my colleagues sat in a loose half-ring, drinks in hand, the ocean a black shape just beyond us. I stayed a little apart, closer to the edge of the firelight, not sure if I was avoiding him or waiting for him. He arrived late again. He didn't sit right next to me, but close enough that I could feel it, the shift in air when he lowered himself onto the bench, the faint scent of salt and cedar that clung to his shirt. For most of the evening, we didn't speak directly. He laughed with someone across the circle, asked another if they'd tried snorkeling, made some offhand comment about the firewood. But there were looks. Not long ones. Not obvious ones. But enough. Enough to turn every moment into something taut, like a string pulled too tight between us. When the fire burned lower and the group began to scatter, he stood. I thought for a moment he would leave without saying anything. But as he walked past me, he stopped. Just for a second. "Good night," he said quietly. The words were nothing. Just a farewell, the kind you'd give anyone. But the way his voice dropped, the way his eyes caught mine as he said it, I felt it long after he was gone. That night, lying in the bed that wasn't mine, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of the waves, thinking about how a single kiss could turn into a silence louder than anything I'd ever known. The fourth day on the island began with clouds rolling in from the horizon, the kind that didn't threaten rain but softened the light, making everything look muted. I woke up before my alarm, restless, as if the night hadn't let me fully rest. The sound of waves felt louder that morning, like they were reminding me of where I was, or maybe who I was becoming. I moved through my villa quietly, not wanting to disturb the two colleagues I shared it with. They were still asleep, their doors closed, their breathing faintly audible in the silence. I made coffee in the little kitchenette, the machine sputtering and steaming, and took the cup out to the terrace. I sat there for a long time, staring at the sea, trying to convince myself that I could make the day feel ordinary. I told myself that I could focus on the schedule, the planned activities, the mandatory group sessions, and avoid him if I needed to. But beneath those thoughts was something heavier, an ache I didn't want to name. By the time we gathered for breakfast, the island felt different, like the novelty had worn off. People looked more tired, the conversations were shorter, and the bright energy of the first 2 days had dulled. I joined a table in the corner, hoping to blend in, hoping to stay unnoticed. But he was already there. The CEO sat at a table near the center, surrounded by a few managers, his expression calm, his voice low as he spoke. He wasn't looking at me, not at first. He didn't have to. Just knowing he was there was enough to make my pulse quicken. I tried to keep my eyes on my plate, on the slice of melon I was cutting, on the cup of tea cooling in front of me. But every few moments, I would glance up, and sometimes he would glance back. The looks weren't long, but they were deliberate. After breakfast, we were split into smaller groups for workshops and creative sessions, the kind of activities HR described as bonding opportunities. My group met in an open-air pavilion with wide windows and wooden floors, the kind of place designed to make people feel relaxed and cooperative. It didn't work. I spent the entire morning pretending to focus on the exercises, answering questions, writing notes on large sheets of paper, smiling when prompted. But my mind wasn't there. It was caught between the memory of that kiss and the uncertainty of what it meant now. I wondered if anyone else could see it, the thread between us, invisible but taut. I wondered if I was imagining all of it. By lunchtime, the clouds had thinned, and the sun returned, heavy and bright. We were led to a shaded area near the beach for another round of group talks. I sat on a low bench, my notebook on my lap, my pen unmoving. And then he walked by. Not toward me, not even close enough to speak, but close enough that the scent of his cologne, something subtle, like cedar and salt, reached me before he did. He didn't look directly at me, not this time, but there was an awareness in the way he moved, as if he knew exactly where I was sitting. It would have been easier if he had ignored me completely. The afternoon dragged, filled with activities that felt meaningless. My colleagues laughed, took photos, made plans for the evening, but I felt out of step, as if I was living in a different time zone. Back in the villa, I stood in front of the mirror, staring at myself. I didn't look different, not in the obvious way, but I felt different. My skin felt warmer, my heart beat louder, my thoughts sharper. I changed clothes twice, not for anyone, I told myself, but because nothing felt right. As the sun began to lower, there was another gathering planned, this time a casual cocktail hour near the water. I told myself I wouldn't go. I told myself I needed space, distance, air. But I went. The setup was simple, tables with white tablecloths, lanterns hung between trees, the ocean a dark line behind it all. People stood in clusters, drinks in hand, their voices carrying over the music playing softly from a speaker hidden somewhere in the sand. I tried to blend into a group from another department, nodding at their jokes, sipping my drink slowly. But I felt his presence before I saw him. He was there. Not across the space, not halfway down the beach, close. Our eyes met once, briefly, and it was enough to send a quiet shock through me. He wasn't smiling, not exactly, but there was something in his look, steady and intent, that made it impossible to turn away. For most of the evening, we didn't speak. He stayed on one side of the tables, I stayed on the other, and the space between us felt as heavy as the ocean air. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of the kiss, of what it meant, of what it could mean. When the event ended, people drifted back to their villas in pairs and trios, their voices fading into the night. I walked slower, letting them pass me, telling myself I wanted to be alone. But I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn immediately. The sound of them, measured, unhurried, followed me down the path lined with lanterns. When I finally did turn, he was there. Not close enough to touch, not so close that anyone could call it more than coincidence. But he held my gaze for a moment longer than anyone else would have. And then he said nothing. He just walked past, heading toward his own villa, leaving me in the quiet path with my pulse loud in my ears. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, the night pressing in, knowing that I couldn't keep pretending this was just a coincidence, that I couldn't keep telling myself nothing had changed. Because something had. And it was only going to grow. The fifth morning felt almost unreal, as though the island itself had begun to blur the lines between what was work, what was rest, and what was something else entirely. I woke earlier than usual, not because I was refreshed, but because my mind was too full. The ceiling above my bed was lined with wooden beams, and I stared at them for a long time before I finally swung my legs over the side. The villa was silent, except for the distant sound of waves and the hum of cicadas outside. I moved through my morning like an echo of myself, making coffee, dressing, brushing my hair, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every movement was weighted by thought, by the knowledge of what had already happened, and by the quiet, impossible question of what might happen next. Breakfast was slow and subdued, as if everyone had begun to feel the fatigue of the retreat. People spoke softly, laughed less, moved slower. I sat at the corner of one long table, deliberately placing myself between two colleagues who spent most of their time talking to each other, leaving me in a safe silence. And then he walked in. The CEO didn't hurry, didn't look rushed the way others did when they were late. He moved through the space the way he always did, like he belonged to it, like it bent slightly to accommodate him. He spoke to a few people, shook someone's hand, nodded to another, and then his eyes found me. It wasn't a long look, but it felt longer than it was. Enough to remind me of everything that had already happened. Enough to remind me that I was pretending not to care. After breakfast, the day unfolded into a series of planned activities, team strategy sessions in the shaded pavilion, a walk along the shoreline with an overenthusiastic HR coordinator who kept using words like synergy and reconnection. But all of it passed in a haze. The only thing that felt sharp, real, was the awareness of him. By midday, the sun had turned harsh again, flattening the colors of the island. We were given a few hours of free time, a break before the evening's scheduled group dinner. I told myself I'd stay in the villa, read a book, clear my head. I didn't. Instead, I found myself walking along the narrow path toward the beach. The sand was warm under my sandals, the wind heavy with the smell of salt. A few colleagues were scattered along the shore, some lying on towels, some dipping into the water, but the beach wasn't crowded. I saw him before I thought about what it meant. He was standing near the edge of the water, shoes off, trousers rolled just enough to keep them dry as the waves brushed over his feet. He wasn't surrounded by anyone. No assistants, no managers, just him, standing in the shallow surf, looking out at the horizon. I told myself to keep walking. But I didn't. I slowed. And then, somehow, we were close enough to speak. "You found the quiet part of the island," he said, his voice low, his eyes still on the water. "It's hard to avoid," I replied, and it sounded lighter than I felt. We didn't speak much after that, not at first. We stood there, the waves touching the sand around us, the ocean air thick between us. When he finally turned to face me, there was something in his expression I couldn't read. Not a smile, not a frown. Something heavier, something that felt like both a question and an answer. And then, just like that, we kissed. It wasn't the same as the first time. The first kiss had been a shock, sudden and quick, something that felt like it could almost be written off as a mistake. This one wasn't. This one was deliberate. There was no hurry, no hesitation. Just that single, undeniable moment. When it ended, there were no words. He looked at me for a long second, then turned slightly back toward the water. I stepped back, my pulse loud in my ears, the sound of the waves almost swallowed by the sound of my own heartbeat. We didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about what it meant or what would happen next. We just stood there, as if the kiss had rearranged something we couldn't put back the way it had been. Eventually, we walked back along the beach, not together, but not apart either. By the time I reached the villa, my hands were trembling. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, thinking about how 2 kisses, just 2, could change the shape of everything. That evening's dinner felt surreal. I sat at a long table under a string of lanterns, surrounded by colleagues who were chatting and laughing as if nothing had shifted in the world. And maybe nothing had, for them. For me, everything had. He sat across the space, his voice low as he spoke to someone, his posture easy, his face calm. We didn't look at each other much. But when we did, it felt like there was no one else in the room. I went to bed that night with the sound of the ocean outside my window and the feeling of that kiss still lingering like a weight I couldn't set down. And for the first time since I arrived on the island, I knew this wasn't something I could dismiss. It wasn't an accident anymore. The day after that second kiss felt like crossing into some unmarked territory. The air felt different, though nothing had changed around me. The same waves rolled against the shore, the same cicadas buzzed in the trees, and yet everything seemed sharper, heavier. I woke before sunrise again, my body restless, my thoughts even more so. The villa was quiet, the kind of quiet that almost hums, and for a while I just sat there on the edge of the bed, staring at the shadows on the floor, wondering how I'd reached this point without even noticing each step along the way. At breakfast, I found a seat off to the side, near the edge of the terrace. I hoped the distance would let me breathe, but it didn't, not really. He came in after a few minutes, moving with that same unhurried confidence, exchanging easy greetings with colleagues. He didn't come straight toward me, but I felt his presence the moment he stepped into the space. My body reacted before my mind did, my pulse quickened, my breath came a little shorter, even as I kept my eyes on the plate in front of me, slicing my toast into smaller and smaller pieces I barely touched. When our eyes met, it wasn't long. It never was. But it was enough. That steady, deliberate glance held more weight than entire conversations with anyone else. The day's schedule was packed again, as though HR thought they could fill every gap with engagement. There was a workshop about innovative thinking, followed by a discussion circle about trust and accountability. I sat in each session, pen in hand, nodding when appropriate, scribbling notes I didn't care about. But I couldn't focus on anything for more than a few seconds at a time. I kept thinking about those kisses. I kept thinking about how quickly the ground had shifted under me, how 2 small moments could rearrange the map of my entire life. When lunch ended, I found myself wandering. There were no official activities for a few hours, and most people scattered, some to nap, some to swim, some to call home. I told myself I'd go back to the villa and rest, maybe read something to keep my thoughts from spiraling. But instead, I found myself walking along one of the quieter paths, the kind that curved around the back of the resort, away from the main clusters of buildings. The air was thick and warm, the kind of heat that pressed against you instead of just surrounding you. I didn't expect to see him there. But he was there. Standing near one of the smaller pavilions, his jacket slung casually over one arm, his shirt sleeves rolled just enough to feel informal. He wasn't with anyone, and I didn't know if that was coincidence or choice. He didn't speak right away, and neither did I. For a moment, it was just silence, the kind that felt too heavy to be accidental. "You seem quiet today," he said finally, his voice even, measured. I managed a small answer, something like, "It's been a long week." The words felt inadequate, but I couldn't think of better ones. The conversation didn't go much further, not in words. There was no need. There was already too much being said without speaking. I walked away before it could turn into something more. But even as I left, my hands felt unsteady, my breath uneven. By the time the afternoon ended, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. My thoughts were frayed, my resolve even more so. The evening brought another gathering. This time it was on a wide deck overlooking the ocean, lanterns swaying gently in the breeze, tables lined with bowls of fruit and glasses of wine. People were laughing, talking too loudly, taking pictures in front of the view. I tried to keep myself at a distance, standing near a group from another department, smiling politely when they made jokes I didn't really hear. But eventually, inevitably, he was there again. He didn't come directly to me, not at first. But his presence shifted the space, like the temperature had changed, like the air itself had thickened. Our eyes met across the deck. And in that single moment, it felt like the noise of every conversation around us faded, leaving only that look, that awareness, between us. Later, when most people had drifted back to their rooms, I lingered. I told myself it was just to enjoy the breeze, to watch the last light fade into the water. But when I turned, he was there. Closer this time. We didn't speak much, just a few words that meant less than the silence between them. He didn't ask me to stay. I didn't ask him to leave. But the look we exchanged said everything neither of us wanted to say aloud. That night, lying in bed, I felt the weight of it, the way everything had become inevitable in a way I didn't dare admit, even to myself. I told myself I could still step back, that nothing had gone too far. But I think I already knew that wasn't true. The 7th day began with a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. The clouds were still thin, the sun still gentle in the early morning hours, but everything felt weighted, as though something inevitable was slowly approaching. I sat on the small balcony of the villa with a cup of tea, staring at the shoreline as the waves moved in their endless rhythm. My colleagues were still asleep, their doors closed, their soft movements audible in muffled thuds and creaking floorboards. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. The polite stories I told myself, that I was just caught up in the setting, that it was just an island illusion, felt brittle now, like dry leaves ready to crumble. 2 kisses, dozens of stolen looks, the silence between us that seemed to speak louder than any words. None of it felt like something that would vanish when the plane took me home. The day passed in pieces. Breakfast blurred into a morning workshop I barely listened to, the sound of pens scratching paper and chairs shifting on the wooden floor filling the air. I heard his voice once, across the room, low and steady, and it was enough to make me tense, to feel heat rise in my chest. By lunch, I felt restless, almost raw. I walked down to the beach alone, taking my sandals off to let the sand sink under my feet. The ocean stretched wide and indifferent, the horizon shimmering like glass. I told myself I needed to clear my head. But when I turned back toward the path, he was there. He wasn't close, not at first. He stood at the curve of the trail, his hands in his pockets, looking like he was considering whether to speak or walk away. For a moment, neither of us moved. The breeze pulled at his shirt sleeve, the kind of meaningless detail my mind clung to because everything else felt too much. "Are you avoiding the afternoon session too?" he asked lightly, but his voice wasn't light. "I needed some air," I said. He nodded, not smiling, not teasing. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. The space between us felt loaded, like every breath carried the weight of a decision neither of us was saying aloud. The afternoon drifted into evening. The sky turned the deep, aching orange of a sun that didn't want to leave. The schedule called for another dinner, another shared table, another night of polite small talk and forced laughter. But I didn't go to dinner. And neither did he. I don't remember how it happened exactly, only that one moment I was sitting in my room, staring at my suitcase, and the next I was walking down the quiet path toward his villa. The night was warm, the lanterns casting small circles of light, and the sound of the ocean filled everything. I didn't knock loudly. The door opened. We didn't speak, not really. Words would have been clumsy, wrong, unnecessary. What happened after that didn't feel like a decision anymore. It felt like something that had already been decided long before I reached his door. That night, we spent the night together. I woke before dawn, the room heavy with silence. The curtains stirred slightly in the breeze, and the sky outside was just beginning to pale, that soft gray that comes before morning fully arrives. I sat there for a while, staring at nothing, my thoughts scattered. There wasn't guilt yet, not in the way I expected. There wasn't joy either. There was just a weight, a quiet understanding that nothing could go back to how it had been. When I finally left, the path was empty, the lanterns dimming in the first light of day. The island was waking up, birds starting their calls, waves still moving in their endless, indifferent way. I walked back to my villa, my hands unsteady, my steps slow. The air felt different now, not because the island had changed, but because I had. And I knew, with a kind of sharp certainty, that nothing about my life would ever feel the same again. Morning broke quietly, as if the island itself was holding its breath. I woke up before my alarm, the room still dim, the sound of the ocean creeping softly through the window. My head felt heavy, my body even heavier, as if the previous night had sunk into me, settling in places I couldn't reach. I sat on the edge of the bed for what felt like a long time, staring at my hands, at the faint creases on my palms, at the floorboards beneath my feet. The villa was silent. The other two women I shared it with were still asleep, doors shut, breaths soft and distant. It should have felt like any other morning. It didn't. I dressed quietly, careful not to make noise, and walked out to the terrace with a mug of tea. The sky was pale, not yet the full blue of day, and the air carried that early stillness that almost feels like forgiveness. I stared at the horizon and waited for the guilt to come in full force. It didn't. What came instead was something far quieter, and somehow heavier, a hollow kind of knowing. The previous night hadn't been a mistake that could be tucked away. It wasn't the kind of thing that blurred into memory. It was something sharp and undeniable, and it sat between me and every thought I had. Breakfast was scattered that morning. People came at different times, looking tired, some moving slower, some talking less. I took a seat by the edge again, half hidden, hoping to be left alone. He arrived later, not late enough to stand out, but late enough to make me notice. He didn't look at me right away. He moved easily through the room, greeting a few people, saying something to one of the managers, his expression calm and unreadable. When his eyes did meet mine, it wasn't for long, just a brief connection, but enough. Always enough. The weight of what we'd done clung to me all through the morning. The workshops, the planned sessions, the chatter of colleagues, it all felt distant, like voices heard through glass. I sat through presentations I didn't hear, wrote words in my notebook I couldn't remember. By lunch, whispers started. Not about us, not yet, but about him. A few colleagues joked about how the CEO looked unusually relaxed. Someone laughed that he seemed to be enjoying the retreat more than the rest of us. I smiled weakly, pretending not to notice, but every word prickled. I kept my distance that afternoon. I told myself it was intentional, a line I was drawing, a way to take back control. I stayed in the villa longer, walked the far side of the beach, kept to groups of people instead of drifting off alone. But the awareness didn't leave. Even when I didn't see him, I felt him, the possibility of him, the way the air seemed thicker whenever he was near. By evening, another gathering had been arranged, this one more casual, more relaxed, as HR described it. The sun had set early behind a thin layer of clouds, and lanterns hung between the trees, swaying slightly in the breeze. The tables were covered with bowls of fruit and glasses of wine, music low enough to fade into the background. I went, though I didn't want to. I told myself I had to, that staying away would raise questions, that avoiding everything would only draw more attention. The crowd was easy at first, everyone talking in little circles, their laughter spilling into the night. I stayed near the edge, holding a glass I barely touched, listening without listening. Then he arrived. Not late this time, but not early either. The moment he stepped into the space, I felt it. That shift in the air, the subtle turning of heads, the way the noise dipped for just a breath before returning. He didn't come to me. He didn't have to. Our eyes met across the tables, and that was enough. We didn't speak, not then, not there, but the silence between us carried more than any words would have. Later, when the evening began to thin, when people started drifting back to their villas in pairs and groups, I stayed. I told myself it was just to take in the view, to feel the breeze a little longer, to be alone. But I wasn't alone for long. I heard him before I saw him, the soft sound of steps on the wooden deck, the slight scrape of a chair being moved. When I turned, he was there. He didn't say much, and neither did I. Just a simple good night when the space between us felt too thick with unsaid things. I nodded, my throat too tight for much else. He walked away first, leaving me on the deck, my hands still wrapped around the glass I hadn't finished, my heart beating unevenly. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, the room darker than it had been all week, the air heavier. There was no undoing any of it now. And for the first time, I felt the faint, creeping edge of something that might not have been guilt, but was close enough to sting. The morning I left the island, the sky was washed in a pale, hesitant gray, as though it couldn't decide whether to brighten or brood. My suitcase felt heavier than when I'd arrived, though I hadn't bought anything new. I moved through the villa in silence, careful not to wake anyone, folding the clothes I'd barely worn, tucking away shoes that still held grains of sand. Each item I packed felt like a reminder. The sundress I'd worn on the beach. The linen shirt that still smelled faintly of the salty air. Every fold felt like sealing away a memory, only for it to push back against the zipper. The ferry ride back to the mainland was quiet, too quiet. Most of my colleagues dozed in their seats, their conversations short, their laughter dulled by fatigue. I sat near the window, staring at the sea. It stretched endlessly, calm and indifferent, like it hadn't seen what I'd done, hadn't held the weight of all that had happened. He was there on the ferry, of course. He sat near the stern, speaking quietly with someone from management. He didn't look at me. Not once. Not in the way that mattered, at least. And maybe that was the worst part, how cleanly he could fold this trip away, how easily he could step off the island and into his life again. I told myself I could do the same. I lied to myself the entire journey home. The airport felt like another planet. The sharp smell of coffee from the kiosks, the harsh lighting, the shuffle of impatient travelers, it was all so ordinary, so jarringly normal. I almost welcomed it, that wall of routine crashing back into me. But as I sat in the terminal, my phone buzzed with a message from my husband, *, did you land? How was it? *. The words were simple, harmless. I stared at them for longer than I should have, unable to think of how to answer. When I finally walked through my own front door that evening, it felt like stepping into a life I'd seen from a distance. Everything was in its place, the shoes lined neatly by the door, the faint smell of last night's dinner, the low hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. My husband stood there, waiting, smiling the small, careful smile he always did when I came home from trips. "You're back," he said. "I'm back," I replied. He reached for my suitcase before I could stop him, wheeling it toward the hallway. He didn't say much else, and neither did I. The silence wasn't sharp, it wasn't angry, but it wasn't easy either. That night, I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling. The sheets felt different against my skin, though I knew they hadn't changed. The room was familiar, every corner, every shadow, but I didn't feel at home in it. The next morning, I thought maybe things would settle. I was wrong. It started with small things. A pause in his voice when he asked about the retreat. The way his eyes lingered on me when I answered. The way my own voice felt too rehearsed, too measured. And then, one afternoon, he held up his phone. A neighbor had sent him photos, harmless ones, at first glance. A group at dinner, a walk on the beach. But there was one. A picture taken from a distance, blurry but not blurry enough. Me, standing on the shore. Him, close. Too close. My husband's voice was calm when he asked, "What's this?" I felt my throat close. The words I tried to summon weren't there. "It was work," I said, but even I didn't believe it. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He just looked at me with a kind of stillness that was worse than anger. And in that silence, I realized that sometimes, the absence of reaction hurts more than any outburst ever could. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen after he'd gone to bed. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. I stared at the cold cup of tea in front of me, feeling the walls press in. I had thought the hardest part would be what happened on that island. I hadn't realized the hardest part would be coming home. The days after that conversation with my husband moved slowly, like the air had thickened around me. Everything felt deliberate, the way he set down his coffee cup in the mornings, the way he closed the door when he left for work, the way his footsteps sounded down the hallway at night. None of it was angry, but none of it was easy either. I found myself moving through the house as though it belonged to someone else. The familiar things, the framed pictures on the hallway wall, the chipped mug I always used for tea, the creak in the second stair, suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if I were looking at them through glass. He didn't bring up the photo again. That silence should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Every time I saw him glance at me across the room, every time his eyes held mine for just a moment too long, I felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down between us. It was a silence that didn't soothe, it was the kind that gnawed at you, the kind that filled every corner until you could hardly breathe. I tried to distract myself. I threw myself into small tasks, rearranging the bookshelves, scrubbing the kitchen counters, reorganizing drawers that didn't need reorganizing. I stayed at work longer, offering to take on extra assignments I didn't want, just to avoid the stillness at home. But nothing worked. The memories wouldn't fade. The island sat in my mind like an unfinished sentence. The salty air, the lanterns swinging in the breeze, the sound of waves at night, they came back to me in flashes, even when I didn't want them. And him, he lingered in the edges of my thoughts, not as a fantasy, not even as a regret, but as a fact. A fact I couldn't erase. He never called. He didn't text, didn't send an email, didn't offer anything that would tie me to him beyond the memories. That should have made it easier. It didn't. Instead, it made me see how separate his life must be, how neatly he must have packed away those days and moved on, how what had consumed me was only a shadow for him. One night, I woke to find my husband sitting at the edge of the bed, his back to me. The dim light from the hallway traced the shape of his shoulders, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. I wanted to. I wanted to say something, anything, to explain, to apologize, to offer words that might lift the silence between us. But every sentence I thought of felt like it would fall apart before it left my mouth. So I stayed quiet. The next morning, he made coffee as he always did, his movements steady, his face calm. He asked if I wanted toast. He asked if I had meetings that day. His voice was level, almost casual. It was worse than anger would have been. Because anger is loud, sharp, and fleeting. But this quiet, this waiting space where nothing healed and nothing broke, that was something I didn't know how to survive. Days turned into weeks, and the stillness in the house didn't ease. I caught him looking at me sometimes, not with accusation, but with something softer and more painful. Disappointment, maybe. Or worse, a kind of distant acceptance. And in those moments, I felt the sharp truth. I had wanted freedom, but I had built another kind of cage. A cage made not of walls or locks, but of guilt, of choices, of things that couldn't be undone. I sat one evening at the kitchen table, the sky outside the window turning from pale pink to dark, my tea cooling untouched. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floor as my husband moved somewhere in the distance. I thought about the island. I thought about the path lit by lanterns, the taste of salt in the air, the way everything had felt suspended there, separate from the world. And then I thought about this house, the one I'd built a life in, the one I'd returned to, the one that felt smaller now. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if we would repair what had been cracked, or if the silence would grow so wide it would swallow us both. All I knew was that the line between who I had been, who I had wanted to be, and who I had become was now blurred beyond recognition. And that blur was all I had left.